Welcome. This is Reality on Auction, Particles of Consciousness, a presentation by David Christopher Lawrence. This presentation is about some aspects of reality as seen through the lens of my own learning and experience. Fair warning, this lens may be a little muddy and disjointed. Still, I hope to offer something useful for as many of you who are listening as possible. Also, please be aware that I am aware of the stigma of mental illness, not only in general society, but in some pockets of the occult world as well. For example, a series of books on the Cassiopeia experiment, which were central to my own journey to the underworld, flat out told me that persons suffering from a mental illness should not engage in metaphysical work. Personally, I disagree with this, particularly in cases where mental illness is the gateway to the dark night of the soul necessary for further spiritual growth and development. Still, I do not wish to spend time talking about the stigma of mental illness. Rather, I want to spend time talking about reality. There are lots and lots of takes on reality out there. Few of them agree with one another unless you look real close. So, the question here is not about individual worldviews so much as it is about what those worldviews have in common. What's in reality's basement is the question I am going to attempt to answer through the lens of my own research and personal experience. Mental health in America became my gateway to urban shamanism, shadow work, and ego death. Through these struggles, I forged myself and my intentions. This eventually led me to my role as white lighter to a witch named Isabella, who was also saddled with an American mental health diagnosis. This witch not only called me her white lighter, she also said I was an alchemist, and I think I am, especially in terms of the tarot. Because, for me at least, the tarot is a collection of symbols that contain, funnel, and filter consciousness. In other words, tarot cards and symbols may be used like magical mixing cups for the alchemical manifestation of intent. I will now share with you the story of my misdiagnosis. Due to real-world setbacks, I attempted suicide in 1999 by jumping off a freeway overpass. I survived, even though, due to retroactive amnesia, I remember neither the actual jump nor the following 3 months in the hospital. During this time, when I was not consciously aware of what was going on, I was misdiagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and put on antipsychotic medication. But I would not experience actual psychosis until I stopped taking this medication more than 5 years later, in 2005. Before this break, I never heard voices. Now, years later, I have learned to integrate the experience of hearing voices with a more spiritual or magical take on reality. Also, due to my secondhand exposure to DID through Isabella, I am very familiar with the many ways in which the mind may be divided. Ego death. I subscribe to the trauma-based model of mental illness. This means I believe that external trauma leads to internal trauma. Additionally, internal trauma, when improperly treated, can easily become part of a feedback loop of ever-worsening symptoms and situations. For some, hitting rock bottom in terms of one's mental health can result in ego death, which can, in turn, provide the ego with the opportunity to rebuild itself in better ways. After experiencing my own ego death, I realized that I was breakable. Knowing this, I then asked myself, what cannot be broken? The answer to that question eventually led me to my notion of particles of consciousness. Through ego death, I realized that I was comprised of pieces of consciousness that were as minuscule as they were individual, connected but still separate. This then suggested to me that I was nothing more than a confluence of similarly aligned particles of consciousness, and that these confluences are what determine what takes place in the auction house of reality. In an auction, bidders place bids on items presented by the auctioneer. Particles of consciousness bid for or against other groups of particles of consciousness in a competitive bidding war of agreements that then determines the nature of reality itself. The following slides will chronicle some of the elements of my own auction of consciousness, which became especially pronounced after my suicide attempt and subsequent misdiagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in 1999. Doctors, family, and friends all insisted that I was simply imagining things. I had to learn on my own how to cope with and ride the confluence of my life. Urban shamanism is a form of shamanism outside traditional forms of shamanism. It occurs in isolation and requires the shaman to participate in his or her own psychoactive plant experiences according to their own personal frames of cultural reference, which I will talk about next. This is everything I think I have experienced. The two chemicals underlined have played the most substantial roles in my development: prescription antipsychotics and endogenous DMT. My prescription antipsychotics created for me a diving board into the pool of psychosis. I never knew psychosis until after taking antipsychotics. It was only in their absence that I found myself in such a state, which experience was also coupled with, I do believe, spiritual possession and technological mind control. As for endogenous DMT, that was maybe what my pineal gland threw into the mix in the absence of prescribed antipsychotics. I can't prove that one, but I strongly suspect it is true. This slide lists my esoteric studies. For me, the three items underlined have been particularly foundational: the cube of space, conversations with God, and the fourth way. The cube of space is a map of reality based on the Sefer Yetzirah that may also be interpreted in terms of the tarot. Conversations with God is a series of books by Neil Donald Walsh, which posits a take on reality that is, I think, a very nice blend of pantheism and panentheism. But we don't have time for all of that stuff. What I want to focus on right here and now is the following aspect of Jerdif's The Fourth Way. Jerdif taught that most humans do not possess a unified consciousness and thus live their lives in a state of hypnotic waking sleep, but that it is possible to awaken to a higher state of consciousness and achieve full human potential. This suggests that Jerdif maybe saw most humans as containers of what I will call non-differentiated and adirectional particles of consciousness. Such persons might then be compared to auction houses waiting for their auction of purpose to take place. This slide lists some of the topics I am familiar with in the field of mental health. The two items underlined, spiritual emergence and internal family systems therapy, or IFS, I find particularly meaningful. Spiritual emergence posits that certain mental health crises are not so much the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain as they are instances of one's higher self urgently breaking through a closed consciousness. IFS, on the other hand, suggests that a person's consciousness is often divided into subpersonalities, each of which has their own agendas in relationship to each other and their host, the central I of any given person. It's like having a less dysfunctional version of dissociative identity disorder, or DID. When I talk about my magical intent, I mean my driving force, or forces. My magical intent consists of those external energies, or confluences of consciousness, I choose to channel into the world around me. My ability to choose determines who or what is in control. If I am centered and balanced, then I am in control. If I am neither centered nor balanced, then I am not in control. and consequently possessed by whatever confluence of consciousness is in control. Tarot cards assist in the creation of confluences of consciousness. They are alchemical mixing cups designed to channel certain energies or particles of consciousness in certain directions. For example, if I am interested in increasing my stability in the face of opposition, I might meditate on Key 8, Strength. This is one of the ways in which I express my magical intent, through the alchemical handling of tarot symbology. But even in the tarot, the map is variable. Key 8 or Key Lemniscate. Depending on the deck being used, Key 8 is usually called Strength or Fortitude. In the Thoth deck, it even gets switched with Key 11, normally Justice, where we end up with Key 8 as Adjustment and Key 11 as Lust. And also, when using Arabic numerals rather than Roman numerals, Key 8 may correspond to the number 9 rather than the number 8. I would like to suggest that any tarot card may potentially be turned on its side, as it were, and given infinite meaning. If this is true, then even the tarot may be broken down into infinitesimal elements, that is, particles of consciousness. If everything is comprised of particles of consciousness, then all things disintegrate and reintegrate over time. Various confluences of consciousness compete with one another to determine the waves both of themselves and of their environment. While this lends itself more to the metaphor of an ocean than to an auction, it's mostly due to perceptions of scale, rather than essential mechanics. The ocean and the auction both govern and are governed by the interplay of particles of consciousness. Both oversee and are overseen by what happens next, according to whatever confluences of consciousness are in effect at any given time. And that's my presentation. Thanks for listening.